So before we delve into the topic, we have to first agree on one thing. And once we agree on this, we can start moving forward. What we have to agree upon is what is the definition of self. Let me preempt this and say like this. When we talk about reincarnation of souls, we're not talking about the spark of the soul or the divine quality of the soul or the energy of the soul surviving and reincarnating. We're talking about the reincarnation of self. So the first thing that we have to understand is, what is the definition of self? What makes me me and you you? Like the Kotzker once said, if I'm me because I'm not you, and you're you because you're not me, then I'm not me and you're not you. Do you understand what I'm saying? If my definition of self is only because I'm not somebody else, then that's not me. So then the question becomes, so who am I? What is self? Obviously, everyone's going to say yourself, on a superficial level, is your body. My body is different than your body. That's one definition of self. But when we say we know somebody, or we know ourselves, what do we know? This is an open question. What do you say when you know somebody? What does it mean? What do you know about them? Okay, you know what you look like, but I can know what someone looks like without actually knowing them. Character traits, inclinations, what else? Values. These are good words. Let's give another word that creates, that encapsulates your values, your character traits, your personality. Excellent. When you say you know somebody, it means you know their personality. Okay, how does personality occur? What creates personality? Any ideas? What creates personality?
Nature and nurture.
Excellent. Nature and nurture. Very good. Which is very simply, that definition of self is that we're created with a certain genetic pattern, which is our nature, and then we have experiences that are imprinted on our genetic pattern. The combination of our genetics experiencing things creates personality. So therefore, two children are born the same. Maybe they have a very similar genetic makeup. They have different experiences. Therefore, their personality is shaped differently. They have a different genetic makeup. They can have the exact same experience. And most newborns have the same experience. For the most part, they both are born and they cry and they have to go to the bathroom and they eat. It's basically pretty simple when you're a little child. We all have the same experiences, but those of you who have children, or those of you who remember seeing children, or those of you who remember being a child, will know that there's no two kids alike. Because it's the genetics of one child interacting with the certain experiences that creates one type of child, the genetics interacting with another type of another experience creating another. Could we all agree more or less with that? Okay. Now let's go a little bit deeper. What is an experience, for example? Give me an example of an experience. Right now, you're having an experience? Yeah, okay. Everyone's awake? Thank you. Listening to a fascinating lecture is an experience. Having a thought is an experience. Having an emotion is an experience. Eating is an experience. Every moment that we're awake, we're constantly taking in new experiences. Let's think about this a second. If definition of self is experiences, if definition of self is my genetics having an experience in the present, could I be aware of myself having an experience? Of course. Could I watch myself thinking? Yes. Could I watch myself having a feeling? Yes. But if I can watch myself having an experience, and definition of personality is experience interacting with our genetics, who's the me that's watching myself having the experience? You're following? The moment I have an experience and I can observe myself having the experience, I cannot be the experience. There has to be a me that's the observer of the experience. We'll call this word the experiencer. Who's the experiencer? Wait, you're jumping ahead, but we're trying to go slowly. Who's the experiencer of life? Who's the self that observes of self having the experience? It's a deep question, because if you're going to go any level deeply into yourself, you're going to recognize that there's always going to be a you observing a you. If I tell you, we tried this before, but on a serious level, if I tell you meditate or just visualize that word, National Jewish Retreat, for 5 minutes, just look at those words. You're going to be observing them, looking at them. Then there's a little you that's going to tell yourself, why am I looking at that? Then there's going to be a deeper you that's saying, why am I telling myself not to look at that, but I should be looking at it? Then another voice that's going to be a little even deeper, and it's going to go deeper and deeper and deeper. But where does it end? At which point do you reach the essential self? And is there an essential self, if everything is the experience? So we're going to try to understand this on a deep Kabbalistic level. What's the definition of self, which is important? Who are we? And the reason why it's so important to know who we are, because before we start talking about a past life or a future life, we have to know what we have to be doing here. So what's our purpose? Why are we here? Why are we here? It's a serious question and a very simple question. Why? Now, everybody has an answer to that question, whether consciously or subconsciously. Everybody's life is a response to a certain question. You're living your life today because of a certain question that's forcing the certain response of the way you're living. We have to make sure that the question that we're asking is a correct question. It could be the question is, why am I not wealthy? And therefore I work really hard to make money. Or why am I not successful? And I work really hard to be successful. Or why am I not liked? And I work really hard to be liked. You're following? We're all trying to fill a certain question. A very deep existential question that's asking us, who are we? So we have to, in order to understand processes of souls reincarnating, we really have to get to the bottom of what is the definition of self, who are we, what is our purpose, which is, in the Hebrew word is atikun, what is our correction? And once we understand who we are in the present, we'll get a glimpse of what it really means to live eternally. Not in an afterlife, but even internally in the present moment. And to understand the processes of reincarnation into the next life. Okay, so let's start off again with self. I'm going to use 2 Hebrew words. And then we're going to unpack this idea a little further. But the 2 Hebrew words that we're going to use, one is naran, which is an acronym for nefesh, ruach, and neshama. You have it on page 3. And one is chaya. You see that on page 3? Nefesh, ruach, and neshama. I don't know. If there's more copies, they'll be coming soon. There are copies coming. We don't have to get into the semantics of this. Let me just explain very quickly what this is. Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama are called Naran. This is an acronym. Naran. Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama is functional, emotional, intellectual consciousness. That's who we are. Most people function on a level of Nefesh, which is a place of instincts and reactive emotion. Some people respond to life from a place of Ruach, which is a more emotional place, and some proactive emotional place, and some people act from an intellectual place, which is rational. This is all part of our collective experiences. Then there's the Chaya level, which is called the life force, which is your experiencer. Let's try to, I'm going to give you a visual, so maybe this will become a little bit more palpable. Imagine a sheet of paper, okay? This sheet of paper that you have in front of you is, we'll say this is your genetics. Sorry, let's move on one more second, and then we'll go back to this. When we talked about personality, and we said the definition of self is your personality, where is that personality? No, but where is it? What part of the body contains your personality? What? Okay, you're saying it's not in the body. Let's say, God forbid, a person loses a finger. God forbid. A person's finger is amputated. Did it become less you? No. What part of self, if we actually cut it out of ourselves, we stop being me and you? You're talking about the soul. We don't want to talk about the soul because we have to get to that. We can't jump to spiritual things if we don't have the what? The brain. The brain. Excellent. Very clear. Memory is stored in the brain. Okay? What is memory? What creates memory? Memory is created through your entire past experiences, experiencing the present. The moment you experience the present, that present becomes part of the experiences of the past. So that's why we have different types of experiences throughout life. It could be the exact same thing that we ate a year ago and 10 years ago and 10 years from now, or we can be in the exact same location, but we experience them differently. Correct? We're all familiar. Why? Because the self, which is containing the memory, which is the past, experiencing the present, the past has been changed through the past experiences. So from a year to this present moment, my self has constantly evolved to the place where it's at now, and therefore this self is experiencing something different than the self a year ago. Clear? Okay. Since memory is the part of self which contains the person's personality, or personality, we would assume that the moment a person loses certain brain functions, let's say there's a certain part of the brain that's connected to memory, right? The moment a person, God forbid, has a stroke or an accident, and that part of the brain that's connected to memory is damaged, the person loses memory. However, there's something very interesting that occurs. It's possible that a person that lost memory will also recover memory. And here's something really interesting. People that go through a near-death experience, and assuming this is an authentic near-death experience, so maybe we'll have time to talk about this. A person that goes through a real authentic near-death experience, what actually is occurring is the brain is stopping to function, right? It's slowing down. It's shutting down. What occurs at a near-death experience is as the brain is shutting down, more memory becomes revealed, which is completely counterintuitive to what we think about memory. If memory is stored in the brain is shutting down, we should lose memory. As you get older, certain brain cells are dying, you lose memory. Here, a person's brain is completely shutting down and they have more memory. They have memory even of things that they didn't know they knew. So where is actually memory stored? Some will argue there's a specific location in the brain where memory is stored. Some will say, no, it's not, because you see that people can recover memory, even those parts of the brain are shut down, which is proof that the brain is actually a holographic image, and every part of the brain contains all aspects. So the right part of the brain contains also the left. This is contemporary science, the holographic universe. Now there's another theory, which you can call it a quasi-scientific theory, but it's really very aligned with a more Kabbalistic understanding. And it works like this, that memory is actually not stored in the brain at all. The brain is merely an antenna. It's an antenna.
It's out of town?
The brain is not out of town, hopefully.
No, I didn't
An antenna.
Antenna.
I'm from Brooklyn. Yeah. We need a translator. Okay. The brain is an antenna. There's something that's called a morphic field, but it's not really relevant what this field is called, which is that all memory that occurs is stored in this morphic field, or this energy field, we'll call it, that surrounds the brain. And the brain is merely picks up certain information, what it feels it needs for its own purpose. So let me give you a very simple example how this works. Do you remember what you ate for lunch yesterday? Some people do. Some people will say no. Do you remember what you ate for lunch a week ago? Probably not. What happens if you're a chef and food is your whole thing? Do you remember what you did a week ago, what you ate for a week ago? Probably. What happens if you do something very simply? You ever watch a film with a good friend of yours? A movie, a film? Yeah? You both sit and see the exact same thing? Did you ever notice what happens actually after you watch the film? When you say, did you see this? And the other said, no, that was not in the film. Did you see that? No, that was not in the film. But you saw the exact same thing? What happens? Why do we remember, we both see the exact same image, one person remembers one thing, the other person remembers something else? If you have a spouse, you know this happens 150 times a day. What happens? And everyone says they're right. You're both right. The way it works is very simply. You're walking down the street, and you're interested, you're a real estate person, you buy buildings for a living. And your friend, spouse, boyfriend, whoever this person is an architect. You look at the building. You see the value of how much this building is worth. It's worth $1 million. Your friend sees the architect of the building. 2 minutes later, you have a conversation. He says, did you see the location of the building? It was an excellent location. It was on a corner, perfect access for cars. And the other one says, I didn't even notice that. I noticed that it was very interesting looking and it had this beautiful architecture. Why? Who made that conscious choice for one person to remember the architecture and one person to remember the location of the building? Selective memory. Excellent. But who chooses that selective memory? How? It's automatic. Okay? It basically works like this. Imagine your memory. From you're born, now you're 30. And the last 10 years of your life, you've been studying architect. That's what's lying on your brain. That's what you're thinking about constantly. Your visual sees a building. Immediately, your subconscious, your deeper self says, this information is important for my livelihood. I'm going to remember exactly the structure of the building. I'm going to select to remember this and not the other thing. The other person who's doing real estate doesn't have that backstory. They have another narrative. Their story tells them, don't remember the architecture because it's not really interesting to them. Their story says, remember the location of the building. You're following? So what creates conscious memory, which means memory that we can activate easily, is the selectiveness of our past memory. Our past memory is choosing what to remember constantly. That's why it's very hard to change, because we're constantly dealing with our entire past that's pushing us in a certain direction we want to change. So the totality of our past is our memory, which is having an experience in the present. Now the question becomes, where is the person's full memory? You watched a film. You saw 1 million images. You only remember 10. Where is the other 900,000 plus images? Where did they go? You saw them. They registered. They entered into you. Where did they go? This becomes part of your subliminal memory, part of your subconscious memory. Some will argue these are the images that come out in dreams. These are the intakes that we have throughout the day that are lodged in our consciousness but are not present. We don't have conscious memory of this. The total self, because definition of self, what did we say is self? Definition of self is memory having an experience in the present, which is our past memory having a present experience. Our total self All of that memory is stored on the fabric of our soul. That fabric of the soul is not the experiences, it's the experiencer who's having the experiences. That's the deepest level of our consciousness. Now let's go back to the narrative we said, which was the story of a book. Imagine, in the beginning of life, a blank sheet of paper. Okay? It's blank. It's not colorless, it's just blank. We're going to use colors as just an example, as a metaphor. Let's assume there's a blue color paper and a red color paper. The blue color paper we'll call a soul of chesed, of kindness. This is the spiritual genetic makeup of person number one. Let's call this guy Chaim. Chaim is born with a blue, empty sheet of paper. Yankel is born with a red, empty sheet of paper. Red will be Gvura. This is a person that gets angry very quickly, but has positive traits, and the person has good discipline. This is a person that functions more from a place of Gvura, restriction, judgment. These are two people. These two people are born. They have the first day of life. They both write the exact same story. We got it out of the canal, we cried, and we ate. Story number one on person Chaim, the first line of story in the book of Yankel. It's the same story. But the story is already different. Why is it different? Because it's funneled through the backdrop of one person that's predispositioned towards being open and kind, naturally. And we're going to talk about this if this person gets any merit for this. But this person naturally has a soul, has a body that is consistent to articulate chesed, kindness. And person number two writes the exact same story, but this person is articulating gevura. You're following? And this is what occurs every single moment of life. Every single moment of life, there's actually two levels of self. There's what we'll call the autobiographical self and the experience self. The experiencer self. The autobiographical self is constantly evolving. Day one it writes one line, day two it writes another line, day three another line. And every moment we're alive, we're continuously writing the story. Correct? What is the story? The story is the experiences that we're having. That's affected by the past experience that we had. That's imprinted on the brain and on a deeper level on our soul. Because the brain is just the experiences, not the experiencer. Every moment the person is alive, we are writing this story. Who are we at any point of life? At any point of life, we're the totality of our entire past. Experiencing the present. That's who we are. At any moment. And that's why the difference between a person before they pass on and after they pass on is actually there is no difference. The only difference will be is there's no longer any more experiences. Physical experiences. But in terms of the full memory of self exists before and exists after. Why? Because the brain is not the part of self that contains memory. Is everyone following? Good. Now we'll try to take questions later because we didn't even begin the topic. We're just trying to define self. Now we're going to, I guess we'll begin the topic now. Why not? It's a good time. According to the Ari, there's something that's called Adam Kadmon, primordial being. If you're familiar a little bit with the narrative in Genesis, in the Torah, The Torah describes in chapter 1 and chapter 2 two different versions of the creation of Adam and Eve. In chapter number 1, Adam and Eve are created simultaneously as one being. Chapter number 2 narrative, which is the name Hashem is introduced, the higher name, the transcendent name is introduced into the narrative. Adam and Eve are created as two separate beings. We're going to focus on chapter number 1 narrative. Adam and Eve are created, Zachar v'nekeva borotam. Male and female, he created them, which means that Adam, even though we say the word Adam and you think that we're talking about a male, we're actually talking about something that's called primordial. Primordial is masculine and feminine, male and female. The Torah describes Adam and Eve. We're just going to call them Adam, and it means Adam and Eve because Adam and Eve are a creation of one. The Torah describes Adam and Eve as creation, and then from that, the Torah describes how from Adam and Eve they have descendants, and this is the beginning of the human race. On a spiritual level, the understanding of this structure is that all souls are rooted in the great soul of Adam. So when the Torah describes Adam and Eve as being the parent of the human civilization, what on a deeper level it means that it's the spiritual parent. Okay. Now let's understand what this means. I'm going to describe to you something that's very technical, because that's the only way we can use language, but we're talking about a metaphysical reality, so it's not as literal as it's going to sound. But imagine right next to me is standing a person, both male and female, one being, back to back, however you imagine this image. This being that's standing next to me is going to be called Adam Kadmon, primordial being. This is the root soul of all souls. Every soul is going to be traced to a particular soul in the great soul of Adam. The story in Genesis is that they supposed to only identify with the tree of life, right? In the Garden of Eden, with the tree of life. Instead, they eat from the tree of knowledge. Tree of knowledge is the tree of duality. Toiv v'ra, good and evil. So instead of identifying with the tree of life, which is one, they identify with the tree of life, which is two, dual. Once they identify with the tree of duality, there's separation. The consciousness of separation occurs. There's a breaking apart. In the Talmudic language, and this is what it says in the Talmud, it's not a Kabbalistic structure, the Talmud says that Adam, in the beginning, stretches from one end of the universe to the other, and then shrinks. Obviously it's a metaphor, but the idea is that before he's one, which means that he crosses all universes, there's no separation, and now he enters into a place of separation. Part of our collective tikkun is to recreate this puzzle. That's the tikkun. To recreate the body of Adam in its full form. Bless you. Okay. Here's this body. The body has different body parts. There's hands, there's feet, there's a head, there's different body parts. On a spiritual level, we're going to give these body parts qualities. Because we're talking about soul. This is very loose, but let's just imagine there are souls that are connected with the right hand of Adam. Okay? Souls that are connected with right hand of Adam means that these are souls that are predispositioned to doing acts of charity, kindness. The right hand, charity, giving. This is very generic, but this is what we're going to give this image. Okay? The first Adam and Eve live, this primordial being exists. Soul number one is entering now into a body. This is the first time the soul incarnates into the body. Let's follow this journey. Soul number one comes from the right hand of Adam. The soul is picked from the right hand of Adam. And now travels. Okay? We're going to have to understand because it's a metaphor. It moves and it becomes the soul of person number one, Chaim. You're following? This becomes his soul. What does it mean that it becomes his soul? What does the soul mean? It becomes his, what's that? His deepest self. There's, we said before, memory, genetics, and then there's something that's deeper, which is the experiencer, not the experiences. The deepest level of self, these are multiple layers of self. On the most physical level, he enters into a specific genetic pattern. Who's this genetic pattern? This genetic pattern is conducive for this soul to express chesed, kindness. Why is it conducive? Because the parents were charitable, the grandparents were charitable. Not only is it physically conducive on a genetic level, but also on a nurture level. Not only nature, but nurture. The soul enters like a hand enters a glove. That it fits. This consciousness, this spiritual quality, enters into a person that has the possibility and the capability to articulate this specific aspect of who they are. So therefore, this is their deepest level of their soul. What is the specific person's tikkun? What's his purpose here? This was a soul from the right hand of Adam. Before it was one, now it's shrunk. Or another image would be before it was illuminating, and now it's darkened. What's the intention of this soul coming down into this world? The intention now is for this soul to become illuminated again. How does this soul become illuminated? It becomes illuminated by the person tapping into his natural resources, which is his genetics and his environment, and articulating that specific aspect of his consciousness. If he's there to do chesed, then he has to articulate chesed, or she articulate chesed. How do we know what our specific task is? It's very simple. We're going to first talk in the positive and then the negative. It's very simple. The things in our life that we're constantly drawn to, the positive aspects in our life that we're constantly drawn to, we are supposed to pursue them. Because our sole specific purpose, besides doing everything else, is to specifically do this particular mitzvah. That's what our sole purpose is. Parallel to that, there's another narrative. The other narrative is that just like the body is divided on a Talmudic level, the body is divided into two parts. There are 248 main parts of the body, 365 main veins and arteries, which correspond to the 248 positive mitzvot and the 365 negative mitzvot. And they correspond, so the correspondence is between consciousness, mitzvot, and the body. This means that every person that receives a soul for a specific purpose has a dual purpose. One is to pursue the positive and to overcome the negative. That's our specific task. How do we know what our task is? It's not a mystery. If you just think about it for 5 minutes, not today, think about it tonight, or write a journal. What are the things in my life that I continuously find that I'm drawn to in a positive way? It could be I need to be a teacher, I need to give charity, I need to put on tefillin and keep Shabbos. What are the things that really makes me alive and connected? That's the positive. And the same thing is also the negative. What is the one area of my life that I constantly struggle with? We used the example before of anger. But let's just say it's anger, because that's just a big word. Every day I get angry at the same people for the same things. You know this pattern? Maybe you don't, but some people do. The point is, it's the same thing your whole life. Work on it. That's what you're here for. You can't say, I'm going to work on the good things, on my good qualities. And what I'm good at, that's what I'm going to pursue. That's a good thing. But you know what you become very good at? You know when you're considered very good? Very good is when you can overcome the negative qualities. Like in the Medrash says that Tov, good, is your positive qualities. Very good is your negative qualities. If you can overcome your negative quality, even a little bit, you are achieving tikkun. So we all know what we have to do. Is it clear? Positive pursue, negative overcome. The consistency is because there's a consistency on a spiritual level which corresponds to the physical level. If we have this particular body, we're born at this particular age, we have this particular inclination, physical inclination towards something, we're good at this or that, because on a bodily level we're good at doing these things, this is an indicator that this is what our tikkun is all about. Because the soul is the backdrop, the spiritual backdrop of our physical selves. So know what you're good physically, and that's what you should pursue spiritually. Now, soul number one enters. He comes down. It's a he. It doesn't have to be a he. It can be a she, but it's a he, she, whatever. Soul number one comes down into Chaim. Becomes this person's soul. The spiritual quality is the coloring of the book, correct? Like in the image before, we said, and this book is blank. There's nothing written on the book. What does it mean there's nothing written on the book? There's no past life written on the book, and there's no future life written on the book. It's blank. Now, person number one, Chaim, lives his life. Every day writes a story. Writing a story, writing a story, writing a story. 120, he passes on. Who's Chaim? Who's the personality of Chaim? His totality of his memory. That's correct. His full self is his memory. Right? Where does this soul go? And this is not just when we talk about the soul. We're not actually talking about the spiritual quality. Because here, it's not just the blue color of the book, but it's actually the entire story that's written on the book. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a famous image of a wave in an ocean. Some people are familiar with this. That there's an ocean, and the ocean represents the root soul. So soul of Adam is the ocean. Then there's the waves that rise up and become individual consciousness for individual people at individual times and space. Then the individual soul is going to return back into the great soul of Adam. This is part of the rectification, the tikkun of Adam. So this soul, which now is actually much more comprehensive than before it came down to this world. Because before it descended into this world, it only had a coloring. Now it has a story. So individual memory moves on and becomes part of collective memory. Fully. The totality of our individual memory becomes, at least in the initial stages, there could be processes which we have to talk about. That's afterlife stages. But the first stage is that the entirety of individual consciousness, which is memory, becomes part of the collective consciousness, the collective memory of God. In Kabbalistic terms, it's called the world of Bina, which is the world of active intelligence. So the soul comes down to this world, enters into Chaim. Chaim lives a full life, articulates what it has to do, and passes on 120. The soul is now moving back into the great soul of Adam. Where does reincarnation come into play? That works very nicely. We didn't yet explain what Gan Eden is, paradise, what the opposite of paradise, but maybe we'll get to this idea. But certainly the soul does not come back down to this world. The soul is now perfect. It worked on articulating chesed, overcoming negative chesed, which is kindness without boundaries and no discipline, because everything has its flip side. The positive has its negative side. Overcomes it, and now returns back into the great soul of Adam. What is reincarnation? Okay, now we need to think a little bit deeper again. What happens is like this. When this soul that came from the great soul of Adam entered into the body of Chaim, and we said that the image is that this soul is from the right hand of Adam. Did Chaim have anything besides hands? Yes, of course. He wasn't born a hand. I'm just making sure no one's sleeping. You're with me? Of course, he has an entirety. Okay. Let's imagine, so we have to, even though we talk very concrete, and as if we're talking about objects, we can imagine this more in terms of either a holographic image, which every part contains the whole, or very simply a flame. A flame. Here's a big flame. You take a flame from a flame, and it contains an entire flame. It doesn't contain a little bit of flame or half a flame. It contains the entire structure of a flame. So when soul that came down to person number 1, that became the soul of Adam, Chaim, excellent, just checking, came the soul of Chaim. This soul contains all aspects. It contains a head, it contains feet, it contains a heart, it contains all the parts that it can animate on a physical level. But its predominant feature is the quality of giving. It's like when this person passes on and you have to speak at their funeral and you only have 2 words to say. What are those 2 words? What's those 2 words? What are you going to say? He's a giver. He was kind. He was a good parent. 1 word. That word is a soul. Now, it doesn't mean that word is a soul. That is his specific soul expression in this universe. But he contains everything. Now let's get a little bit physical, then we'll try to go back into the metaphysics. Okay, we'll use the mouse as an example, because that's what's here. Okay. Soul is in the soul of Adam, correct? Now, this soul, which is the deepest level of consciousness, needs to express chesed. Okay? It needs to express kindness. So it chooses, God chooses, it's the same choice. We can talk about that because some Kabbalistic text talks about God choosing, some Kabbalistic text talks about the soul choosing, but really it's the same thing at this point because it's still one with God, it's still in the place of unity. This soul chooses, or is chosen to come down into person number 1, Chaim. Chaim has, for all intended purposes, he has all the capabilities to articulate chesed. He's born in a very loving family, and the family will always encourage him to be kind, encourage him to give chesed, and his genetic makeup is towards chesed. This is what he's working at. And he does it. He writes his story. Every day he's writing another line. You're following? The story is complete. Perfect story. This story is so complete that this entirety can now move and become part of the collective. This will be called perfect Gan Eden. This is paradise. I don't want to explain in detail what this means, but generally this is what the idea of paradise is, that the entirety of self becomes part of the oneness of Hashem. Entirety, there's nothing to delete. You know, sometimes you have to delete. This part of the story is not so good. Okay, we have to get rid of that part. And the deleting process is the Jewish definition of Gehenna, of hell. It's only a deleting process in order to get the soul back into its original place. But we don't have to talk about that. Soul comes back and becomes part of the great soul of Adam. So this part is shining, it's brilliant, it's illuminated, it's perfect. However, this soul, just like this great soul of Adam, had 613 parts. Right? We said there were 248 body parts, 365 main vein arteries, which means that every part contains the entirety. So this means that this also has 630 dimensions. So it worked on chesed. That's beautiful. 1. What happened to the other sides? Let's just imagine physically. It worked on this side. How about this side? And this side? And this side? And imagine this is a cube with 613 dimensions. You're following? Yeah? Trying to? That's the main thing. We have to aspire to understand, not to understand. So now the soul, this soul becomes part of the great soul of Adam. You know what happens now? The soul actually divides itself. This part of the soul, which is perfected already in this world, it reached its perfection, it did what it had to do, it achieved what it had to achieve, stays and becomes part of the great soul of Adam. But this part splits off. And now we have a red coloring, and that moves into Yankel. You're following? Now Yankel has a full soul. He's not just born a hand of Adam. But Yankel, instead of being naturally very giving, is naturally very stingy. That's a negative quality he has to work on, but the positive quality is that Yankel is a very disciplined person. He always keeps by the rules. that okay? He's always doing the right thing, and he has good discipline and good order, and he's a successful person on that level. So on the level of Gvura, he really does his tikkun. Now the Gvura part is the positive and the negative. The negative part is maybe he's prone to anger. The positive part that he's good in this, so he has to choose something positive and overcome the negative. Same story. Yankel lives. He lives his full life. What happens now? Yankel's story goes back into the great soul of Adam. And he joins together with Chaim. He becomes Chaim Yankel. If you're familiar. Anyways, that was a bad joke because I don't tell jokes. So the point is, the souls become unified. Now this is a very deep understanding how we relate to the people in our lives. Because everyone in our lives, everyone that we encounter, especially the people that we have very deep connections with, is because we share common root souls. Now it doesn't mean we come from the exact same soul, but it means we come from the same area in the great soul of Adam. And that's why we gravitate towards each other on a physical level. And on a deeper level, let's say a family unit, for example. A family usually consists, there's a father, there's a mother, there's a kid, let's say and 2 kids. Let's say this is the average. In this family, they all come from the right hand of Adam. So in one life, they were all blue souls, blue and red souls, that's not going to work. Okay, whatever. They're all blue souls, chesed souls in one life. They all go back, they all branch off, and they all come gevura into the next life. You're following?
Mixture of two together.
Correct. There's a lot of mixtures. This is very simplified. But the point is that your parents, I don't know if you, hopefully you get along with your parents, but maybe if you don't, or your siblings, you should recognize that all these people in your life that are put there, or your children, they're all there to help you. And you're there to help them. Because you're all part of one collective purpose, a certain tikkun. And it gets interesting because your parents in one life could be your children in the next life, or your grandparents in the next life, because it's always going to be a mixture, but there'll always be a continuity of this family unit throughout different lives. The only person that stays with you forever is who? Your spouse. Your spouse. All right. Some people are very happy about that. Some people not so.
But what if you had 5 spouses?
That's a good question. Your spouse is the person, I don't want to, it's complicated, but there's something that's called the zivugrishin, which is the perfect spouse or the primary spouse, and then there's secondary spouses. You could be married to many different secondary spouses, and you could be married to your primary spouse. Your primary spouse is also your bashert, or your soulmate. That's the flip side, the male-female dynamic, the masculine-feminine dynamic from the same root. That is really we'll call your soulmate. There are other souls that are connected to your soul that come down that you can have a relationship with for certain periods of time. Sometimes you have a very good marriage for 10 years and then it didn't work out. If that happens, it could be someone that's part of your life, part of your overarching tikkun in your life, but it's not your perfect soulmate. How do you know who's your perfect soulmate? That's a very good question. I can't really answer the question. Now, Rizal says the only way to know is if you're 110 years old and on your deathbed, you had a long life and a successful life and a joyous marriage, and you felt like this person always helped you to articulate, to be your best, and you helped them be their best, and you're about to expire from this world, you can assume that was your soulmate. Other than that, you don't know. So we have to make the best out of it. This is off the topic, but I have to tell you this because it's important. The Talmud says that Zivug Rishon, which means the first soulmate, is according to a heavenly voice. The heavenly voice says, this soul is for that soul. Destiny. These are the 2 souls that are rooted within the great soul of Adam, so that's your bashert. That's your perfect soulmate. Second soulmate like secondary soulmate or zivuk sheni, is lefi masav, according to your actions. So there's a very important interpretation that says like this, that we're not actually talking about two separate marriages. We're talking about the same marriage within a particular context. The first person you marry is bashert. What happens in the marriage is according to your actions. You following? I don't want to depress you, but that's what it is. You basically, your spouse becomes your mirror, in the words of the Baal Shem Tov. Okay, let's get back to more fun stuff. Yes. Yeah, I don't want to take questions because we're running a little late, and we're going to try to finish this. We'll try to finish as much as we can. Overall, this is the way it works. That the family units, okay, we'll talk about that for a moment. The family units are all rooted in the same soul. They come back down, and they're all working on their specific tikkun. The Zohar actually mentions something very interesting, which is every family. Let's say it's a family of doctors. The father's a doctor, the mother's a doctor, the brother's a doctor, the sister's a doctor, and then there's one kid with bleached red hair and he's a punk rocker. Do you know what I mean? So this is a situation that we have. You could be that person, by the way. I'm not, You could be the one kid that doesn't fit in your family. Everyone's doing one thing and you're like on your own trip. It happens. If everyone's part of the same tikkun, why doesn't everyone become doctors? The answer, according to the Zohar, is very interesting. The Zohar says that it could be because in many multiple lives, these souls reincarnated, worked on this tikkun, next life on this tikkun, next life on this tikkun, next life on this tikkun, but they're in the final stages of tikkun and something's not working, it's not helping. Either they became too serious about their work and they became too kasha, the language of the Zohar became too harsh on themselves. And the reason that this soul comes down into this group of family is that this soul is unrelated to this family, spiritually. They come from another area within the great soul of Adam. And they come only to this family, in Yiddish to say, to make freilach. Like to create some little havoc. So don't take yourself, okay, you're a doctor, okay, I get it. It's very nice. But I'm a rocker, it's fine. Life is good. Don't take yourself too seriously. But that's the concept of a general family soul, and in specific, the purpose. According to the way we understand now reincarnation, it'd be understood a very complicated question and a very simple question. If we were in a past lives, if we existed in a past life, why don't we remember our past lives? Now there are multiple answers that can be given. You forgot, the soul is meant to forget, all different types of reasons are forgiven. But the very simple answer, according to the Ari, is because consciously we were never in a past life. On a conscious level, which means the conscious level is the part that's presented in this world. That part of self was never revealed in this world. Only it was revealed to us. So the deepest question that we have to ask ourselves is not who we were and not who we will be. The deepest question that we have to ask ourselves is who are we? Who are we? And how can we answer that question? By simply following patterns. By saying, I'm always inclined to do these positive actions. That's part of my positive pursuit. I'm always trying to overcome these negative. That's part of my negative, overcoming these tendencies. That's my specific tikkun. Now let's imagine this soul wrote a story. And the blue coloring, the backdrop, the story is complete. What's the next stage? So the Zohar the Zohar is the classic book in Kabbalah. The Zohar says like this, that after a person passes on, the Shekhinah appears. The Shekhinah is the divine presence in creation. people observe the Shekhinah as light. Of course, it's not physical light, but it's metaphor. But the way we translate experiences is through the filter of our consciousness, which is three-dimensional, so we use it as light. But it's not light. But the experience is perceived as light. So the first image that occurs is the individual consciousness, which is the totality of memory, which is who we are, fully, observes the light of the Shekhinah. And the Zohar says it like this: Im zachu, if a person is refined, then the soul becomes one with the Shekhinah's light, and then goes on to an afterlife journey, becoming part of the great soul of Adam. Lo zachu, if the soul is not refined, the soul is left in darkness. Let's try to understand what this means. There's a very deep teaching by the Baal Shem Tov, Chassam Sofer, and others that say like this, that there's actually no Gehenna. Gehenna is hell. There's no hell. There's only light. There's only God. There's only holiness. There's only Gan Eden. There's only paradise. The problem is try to imagine yourself looking at the sun. Right? You're looking at the sun. If you're wearing the right equipment to observe the sunlight, it's great. You have a good suntan. What happens if you try to look at the sun without the right filter? You get burned. If you're not wearing protection or you're not wearing sun gear, you get burned. So the same light could be healing and welcoming to one and threatening to another. It could be paradise for one and hell for another. Let's try to understand this. It's important. I'll tell you a little story, even though I promised that I wasn't going to say stories. But the story is like this, that once there was a very wealthy man, his name was Chaim Yankel. And Chaim Yankel decided he's going to make a feast. He was in a little shtetl, he was the wealthiest man, he was the most learned scholar in town. He's going to make a big feast, and he said, put out a proclamation saying, I'm going to make tonight a feast worthy of paradise, of Gan Eden. So of course, it's a poor town. Everyone's excited, everyone comes to the dinner. They all sit down around a large table. Chaim Yankel has a little bell. He rings the bell, the butler comes in and serves one dish to the owner of the home, to Chaim Yankel. So he eats, makes a blessing, enthusiastic blessing, and he's really relishing in this delicious food. Everyone's watching, the beggars are all sitting around, and he's enjoying his meal. So they think that probably this is like the first thing he does. He eats himself, then he feeds everyone else. He rings the bell again, the same thing occurs. First dish, he gets, no one gets. This is a 20-course meal. So imagine you're at the 20th course. He gets, no one else gets. Finally, one person gets up and says, I'm sorry, dear host. We love you, we respect you, you're a beautiful man, but you're making a mockery out of us. You invite us for a meal, and this is what you're doing. He says, I'll explain you something. You know what Gan Eden is? What's Gan Eden? Gan Eden means when you see someone enjoying something that you don't have and cannot have, and you have enjoyment because they're enjoying it. Now that you know what Gan Eden is, now I can give you the meal. The concept of Gan Eden versus the opposite is how attached we are to our ego. If a person lives his life, a spiritual life, what does it mean a spiritual life? Every experience that they have, every imprint in their blue story is positive, is noble, is transcendent, is always trying to get closer to other people, closer to themselves, closer to God. And this person lives a full story. And finally, the story is concluded. Chapter 120, the person passes on. He sees the light of the Shekhinah. And he says, the light of the Shekhinah basically tells him, doesn't verbally tell him, says, you know what, your whole struggle with your ego, you can just let go. You can just let go of all this nonsense and all this holding on and grabbiness. You can just let go because you're now in the spiritual world. You don't need to hold on to all these things. You know what the soul says? Wow, it's amazing. I see the light and I want to become one with Hashem. But imagine Another narrative. Imagine that your whole existence, God forbid no one in this room, of course, everyone is tzaddikim here, very righteous people, but imagine there are some people in the world that their whole sense of identity is their attachment to physical things. And then you're told, no longer physical. But I want to be physical. So the drawing downwards and the pulling of the soul upwards, that is Gehenna. And the process is to extricate ourselves from attachment to the material. There's something very interesting I don't want to talk about, but it's dibuk. You familiar with the word dibuk? There's all different types of processes where the soul needs to learn to untangle itself from its tenacious hold on physicality. And the process is to just let go. If person number one lives a very spiritual life, and a noble life, and a holy life, and every single moment of their life is birthed and infused with eternity. And eternity means the transcendence of ego. If that's the way, or the transparency of ego, I should say, if that's the existence that you have, the moment you pass on, you move on to a higher state of existence, and your totality lives in Gan Eden, in paradise. But if there are certain parts of yourself that are still focused and still bound to the physical, to the ego, those parts have to be loosened. And the loosening process is the way the soul frees itself and becomes able to be turned back to its root. All souls eventually get back to the great soul of Adam. The only question is, how much of we get to return to the great soul of Adam? If every single imprint, thought, feeling, word, and action we do is infused with a sense of spirituality and a higher consciousness, then the totality of ourself lives on now and for eternity. If our thoughts, feelings, words, actions are always connected to the physical things, then that parts of self have to be let go. That's why in the Torah it's a very interesting description where it describes someone that does something tremendously negative, reaches a level of karet. Karet means eliminating the hard drive. That's what it means. The soul is perfect. You can't soil the soul. You can't damage the soul. It's part of God. It's part of Hashem. You can only make a negative stain. You can write a bad story. Some people have to erase a line, some people a chapter, and some people don't have to erase anything. And the flip side of that, some people have to erase everything. And of course, with the power of tshuva, which is the power of transformation, we can undo anything that was done in our past and perfect ourselves at any moment.